Very good afternoon and welcome to this discussion on a new social covenant coming to you live from Stellenbosch University. I'm joined on the stage this afternoon to my immediate right by Reverend Jim Wallis, who is chair of the Global Agenda Council on Values and president and founder of Sojourners USA. To his immediate right, we have Trevor Manuel, who is former minister in the Presidency for the National Planning Commission and former Minister of Finance, South Africa. To his right, we have Derek Yach, who is Executive Director of the Vitality Institute for Discovery, and Suzanne Ackerman-Berman, who is the Transformation Director at Pick n Pay. Before we go any further, let's hear from the Executive Chairman and Founder of the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab.
It's a great pleasure for me to welcome the participants to this conference on a new social covenant. We need such a new social covenant because when we look at the global risk report of the World Economic Forum, the lack of social inclusion is the most important risk which we have identified for 2014. If we do not close the gap between the rich and the poor, and I should also add the gap between the present generation and possibly the next generation, our societies will have difficulties to survive in a peaceful manner. But it's easily said we need a new covenant. How should it look like? How will it be built on values? Now, first, we have to recognize that to integrate all those people who are still in need, to integrate all those who are poor into reasonable living conditions will require economic growth. But just to create economic growth is not enough. We have to also change our thinking. What has happened in the last years, particularly under the pressure of the economic crisis, is that we became all much more egoistic, and if we talk about countries, even more national interest minded. We also became much more crisis driven. So what we have to do is to develop again a much more comprehensive, a much more forward-looking thinking, and of course, a much more responsible thinking. In 1970, I wrote a book, and for the first time, I described what is called now the stakeholder theory, which means that business leaders are not only responsible towards the shareholders, but are responsible towards all stakeholders, which means the employees, the government, those who are living in the neighborhood of the companies, and so on. So we have to revitalize this multi-stakeholder concept, because it means that when we have a responsibility, like the management of a company, we are not just the actors on behalf of one of the interest groups. We are the trustees of the whole. Today, what does it mean in corporate decision making? We are the trustees of the company and not of the shareholder, which means we are obliged to make sure that the company prospers long term. And only in such a way we can fulfill the expectations of all the stakeholders. Even if the expectations of stakeholders may differ at a specific moment, all stakeholders have one thing in mind: the long-term prosperity of the company. We have to make sure that we translate this concept into real decision making. And this means always to feel the trustees of the whole, always to feel the trustees of all those who depend on our decisions. I think that's in a nutshell what we mean with a new social covenant.
That was Klaus Schwab, Executive Chairman and founder of the World Economic Forum. Jim, let's turn our attention to you. You've spent 3 days behind closed doors debating a new social covenant, and I think it's important for our audience, and specifically for those viewers that have joined us across the African continent, to unpack what we are doing in terms of this new social covenant.
Well, I'm wearing the hat of the chair of the Global Agenda Council on Values, which produced this new social covenant, and but I'm also a theologian and a pastor from the faith community. So if you'd allow me a theological statement. In God's economy, there is enough if we share it. It's as simple as that. The Pope wrote a letter to Davos opening night, and he wrote this to the participants. Humanity should be served by wealth, not ruled by it. So I'm going to start there. I also am very glad you're doing this here, because I have been blessed by being in this country many times and got to, as a young man, learn all of be part of the old leaders and the old stories about the miracle of political liberation. But now I've been here for a month, traveling around. A new generation has another vocation, which is economic liberation. Unless that's accomplished, that will threaten the political liberation. So yesterday, we talked about how a new social covenant might help with that. Now, the term is not a new social contract, which is transactional. The idea is a moral covenant, a moral promise. So in the introduction, we talk about choices and values that we decide things by, business, government, civil society. Those choices must be self-conscious, those values, not based merely upon the inertia of accumulated interests. And it says the stakes are high. So there are 3 values that we talk about in this covenant, which we lay out, but I'll just name them briefly. Human dignity. We're all for that. But let me read a statement by my mentor, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Injustice anywhere, he said, is a threat to justice everywhere. Went on to say, we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects us all indirectly. We've got a word for that in Africa called Ubuntu. I'm not human apart from you. I can't be. So I would say the loss of human dignity anywhere is a threat to human dignity everywhere. So we lay that out in this covenant. Second is the common good, which is Ubuntu, all for all. A culture of meism. You know, the selfie picture is an icon of the culture of, it's about selfies, it's about me. We've lost the common good in the US, around the world, politics, economics. How do we hold ourselves accountable to that? And Klaus said, shareholders and stakeholders. Stakeholders are those who are not just in the company, but are workers, they're consumers, they're neighborhoods, they're the environment and future generations. How do we turn a shareholder economy into a stakeholder economy? That's well said by Klaus. Finally, stewardship, which is a spiritual term for sustainability. Okay? Here's 2 metrics. Quarterly shareholder profit and loss statements. If that's our only metric, we're in serious trouble. Indigenous people say you evaluate decisions today based on their impact on the 7th generation out. Very different time frame there. Short-termism in politics and economics is why we're in the situation that we're in. How do we change our metrics? So we go through what I call in the covenant, I'll close with this, I call the uneconomy. Uneconomy. Unfair, unsustainable, unstable, and unfulfilling, and actually making a lot of us very unhappy. So we go through that in the covenant, and we make it clear talk about this in discussion and values. I love this conversation. But values don't matter if they don't lead us to change our decisions, our decision making. How we turn ideas into action was our whole conversation yesterday about South Africa.
Jim, thanks very much for that introduction. Trevor, I had the opportunity to chat to you yesterday. You said that this whole process is far too polite. It needs to get a little messy. So what do you suggest as the next step?
I think that the first thing we've got to do is understand that the paradigm of economic development that we live in is wrong. If you don't accept that, then whatever covenants you have no impact at all. Part of the agenda must be to drive change and to commit to driving change. And to be informed by what we see around us. As an African, I'm very conscious of the number of my fellow Africans who are dying from Ebola right now. There's no vaccine available, there's no treatment available, but turn on your television and you'll see an ad for erectile function disorder. Because the emphasis of pharmaceutical companies is wrong. And unless we reorient the paradigm, the incentive structure of what happens in the world is wrong. And this is what we have to get right. Part of it is understanding what the basic needs of people are and ensuring that we don't leave people behind in the way in which we take decisions. So the questions that confront us are about what a good society is. But more importantly, we need to know what is not happening right now. We need to understand why things have gone as badly wrong, because certainly at the end of World War II, there was a clear understanding of togetherness. The Marshall Plan, funded by the United States at the end of World War II, was an endeavor to take taxpayers' money to fix what World War II had gotten wrong. Development happened in countries that had access to the Marshall Plan, but since then, we now live in a world where increasingly we are all compartmentalized and individualized, and there's no sense of social solidarity. And you can't have a coherent, globalized economy without that sense. So the covenant must drive the sense of social solidarity to enable us to actually start fixing things. Once we have the orientation of where to get to, we have to hold decision makers to account for why we aren't making progress.
Derek, what about the criticism that the people who are debating a new social covenant are far removed from those who are actually going to have to execute on it? Is that fair?
I think it's one of those endless debates you can have, and you can really wring your hands and say, how are we going to get a broader, more inclusive group? Let's have everybody around the table and keep talking forever until you have everybody giving their word. Or you can sit back and say, in the discussions that we now have, are sufficient people with enormous power, authority, and capability to play a much more significant role in changing the world for good? And many are. How do we accelerate that? How do we, through all of our major networks, bring in a wider range of people while we are accelerating change, rather than waiting to start when you've had a completely inclusive debate? And I think that having spent many years in other World Economic Forum settings, I saw this move from those kind of debates very slowly in some settings where you continue talking about becoming more inclusive and actually not taking action, to those in the agricultural sector of the World Economic Forum saying a huge problem in Africa is that they are producing, on average, 1 ton per hectare compared to 3 to 5 tons in many other parts of the world. If that continues, starvation and famine will follow. How do we address that? And engaging the heads of state, starting with the Prime Minister, the President of Tanzania, the heads of corporations from the food, agricultural, retail sector, has meant that they're no longer talking, they're growing. And they're growing stuff that's actually going to address these issues. So I think, yes, we could have a better representation, but let's start with what we've got, and we can already make significant impact.
Well, Suzanne, let's add to the private sector voices in the room and get your thoughts on how corporate South Africa is going to respond to the covenant.
Well, I don't actually think it's only the role of corporate South Africa. I think the role of business in society actually is the one who needs to action and address all the issues that the previous speakers have spoken about. We need to understand what the inequalities in our society are, whether it's the difference between the rich and the poor, the young and the old. And as business, we are the ones who are equipped to address those inequalities, to create the jobs, to provide the skills needed, to address the food crisis issues by engaging with people as small farmers, small traders, small producers, bring them into the formal economy, give them an access to the market. And those are very practical matters where business across Africa can actually change and help transform the economies.
Do you believe that business is rising to the challenge from what you are seeing on the ground?
I do. I don't think it's happening fast enough. I think there's a lot of talk. I think practice is lagging behind principles in some matters. But I do actually believe it is happening. And I do think that in South Africa, the BEE codes of good practice are actually going to help accelerate the process. But it needs to be a more meaningful measurement. And I think a conscious social attitude to transforming and changing from the ground level and addressing those inequalities quite seriously.
Jim, yesterday when I interviewed you, you said to me, today I need to ask you very tough questions. I need to be a good journalist. So I'm going to turn the tables on you and I'm going to go, what is the most difficult question anybody could ask you right now on a new social covenant?
Well, the issue, as I've heard for a month across your country, is inequality. More inequality here now than during apartheid. Now, globally, the covenant says, 19th century, the ratio of the rich 20% in the world, the poorest 20%, 7 to 1. The end of the 20th century, it's 75 to 1. My country, the top 400 people have more wealth than the poorest 150 million people. 400, 150 million. Executive salaries to average worker, 30 years ago, 30 to 1. Now it's 515 to 1. So that has got to be addressed. To me, that's the central question here. Stakeholders.
We know it needs to be addressed. Remember, I want to hear your tough question, but let me just pull back to the fact that we need to address inequality. How are we going to do that? Because we all know that it needs to be addressed. What are tangible moves to actually making that a reality? Is it possible, in other words, sir?
Well, it better be, because if you don't deal with this here, and we don't, we're in trouble. Trevor said it well. If people are focused on survival, then people who are trying to survive, will do anything to survive. Solidarity versus survival. Solidarity means you feel a part of something. Do black South Africans feel like stakeholders in this economy, real stakeholders? Survival versus solidarity. And so I think you've got to deal with income, you've got to deal with land. You've got to deal with the people who ran the country during the days I was here with apartheid are still running the country. And how do people, the young kids I talk to on Soweto streets, well, how do they think life has changed for them? That's the tough question. On the street, to me, it's got to be street level, on the street. And the room we had yesterday was a powerful group of people, but I would say we were all the included. So how do the included deal with those who are, as Klaus said, the excluded? That's the issue.
So the tough question is, how do we reach the people on the street?
Take the street, yeah.
Trevor, let's get your thoughts, because I know this is also very close to your heart.
I think that it's important to go back to what you raised earlier, Bronwyn. We need to get those dissident voices in the room. You need the disagreement. I forget who it was who said, people enjoy sausage, but you don't want to see how it's made. A covenant like this is going to be messy. It has to be messy. It can't just be nice, wealthy people sitting, talking to each other, laughing about the world. There are voices out there that represent the excluded, and they're there because they're poor, they're there because they're young, they're there because they're unemployed. Unless we get those voices talking to us, unless we understand what the issues are, the idea that you can bake this covenant very neatly in Davos and try and sell it to the world is not going to work. It'll be an exercise in futility. Part of what we have to do is take these ideas out. Now, The question is, when do people begin to feel a sense of participation? The person who we're honoring, the late Professor Russell Botman, was very focused on what he referred to frequently, the pedagogy of hope. He had a very simple description for it. If I feel that today is better than yesterday, then I will have a sense that tomorrow will be better than today. And you can only communicate that sense if you actually are in touch with people who are in a different position to what you are. And I think that is the call, and you know, as irritating as some of those voices must be, I think that drafters must actually get out and be constructively engaged with people who aren't of the same mind right now, but the objective must be to have a persuasion around some central themes. But then it's also important to hear what trade unions say in this country. Frequently they say, yes, you'll have a covenant if we all agree on what to give up. And so they bring the breakfast story into play. And people who have particular religious beliefs, forgive me for the analogy, but they say you can be the chicken and lay the egg and move on and lay another egg. The chicken lives on, parts with the egg. Or you can be the bacon, and the bacon comes from the back of the pig who's slaughtered to produce the bacon. Who gives up what to produce the covenant? Because what we have is wrong, and if you want to fix it, then you've got to have agreement about who gives up what. If you don't have that, then we've constructed a framework for very generous discussion between ourselves without the objective of trying to construct repairs in society.
Derek, one of the other very important discussion points has been that it's not just about a high-level new covenant that we're going to set. It's about many covenants that will be made among geographies, specific country covenants, industry covenants, business covenants. So now let's find out how we make tomorrow better than today, to borrow from Trevor. Where's the starting point for discovery? Bring it home.
Well, I'd say it starts with that most precious element that we all value, our own health, our own life. And if you think about the way in which the covenant is going to translate into action, for me the most visible proof of it would be first in how employers work with their employees' health and value the fact that that is the source of productivity, morale, retention, growth, and long-term profitability. And it then moves to the families of the employees and recognizes without the family investment, you won't actually have the employees on board. And once you've made that leap, it's not a big jump then to say, well, those families are living in a community, and employers have a responsibility to partner with communities in very different ways. And I think Suzanne can probably speak to some of the practical ways we're starting to see it. Discovery knows that, because we know from the data that we've done, and everybody understands intuitively, that as health starts improving, you start having a virtuous cycle improving. Productivity improves, morale improves, retention in the workforce improves. So I would say that the one area, the entire focus on health, is one where you can see a practical outcome of the covenant. But there's a second one I just want to touch on hearing the discussion. And that's the role of science and technology. I think I get a bit worried when I hear discussions that stay just at the level of values and morals, and then jump to economics, without going back to some of President Bill Clinton's words almost 25 years ago, when he actually wrote in Science a very interesting article. And the key line was that brains are globally distributed. Their use is not. What he was referring to was the fact that we have extraordinary intellectual capability in every country, in every society. We give them the opportunity to engage initially in science and technology. We will see an extraordinary explosion of activity that will start addressing some of the economic issues we're talking about. And the proof of it came home to me recently when there was a follow-up meeting when President Obama hosted the heads of state in Africa in Washington, where we had a follow-up meeting with the heads of the African Academies of Sciences from across the continent. And they made this point very strongly. Why are we not seeing greater investments in the academies of science across Africa? If you do that, that is one of the best long-term investments in stimulating the kind of sustainable innovation, turning those brains to very powerful use, generating the entrepreneurial spirit that is just below the surface and if given a little bit could actually be scratched. And the proof of it, that it's happening across Africa. People watching in Kenya today are no longer using money and credit cards, they're using M-Visa, the most sophisticated way of transferring funds on the planet. They're showing us how to do it. Not from here, in the Karoo, you have the largest science experiment on the world, the Square Kilometre Array, that is attracting scientists from Africa and showing that the future is positive if we actually look through the eyes of science. So I would say both health for our individual needs and science as a hope for the future are two of the broad sectors where, if we're really going to make a difference and translate the covenant into action, we should be giving greater attention.
Suzanne, let's bring Pick and Pay into the discussion. Focusing on the tangibles, what are you doing towards that social inclusion, which, as Klaus Schwab has stated, is probably, or the lack of social inclusion, is one of the biggest risks that the world faces?
Thanks, Bronwyn. And we are currently present in 7 African countries. And we have a very deep philosophy that business is not about maximizing profit alone. And if that small principle can be taken across the globe, we'd be able to transform and change the mindset of the business's implication and application into society. So we are working where, in every country where we're at, we'll try and engage with the local procurement and the sourcing. And there is no reason for us to source tomatoes in Italy or South America when we grow them right on our doorstep. Here, Kenya, Zambia, whatever country we're in, they grow. And understanding the natural resources and the sourcing of product into the formal economy, that's going to create the jobs. That's going to address the needs of food security. That's going to create empowerment for individuals who are servicing their own society. And that's fundamentally the role that big business, whether it's procurement, manufacturing, or retail, can appreciate and do wherever they go and practice their business practices right around the country or the continent.
Trevor, let's bring the National Development Plan into this discussion. And again, when we spoke yesterday, you threw forward to the example of the National Collaboration Education Trust under Sizwe Ngasana, and the fact that you are seeing tangible results of that. And I suppose really it's a covenant. Can I use that terminology? Because it's government, business, civil society, and labor moving to make a difference at the ground level. So speaking to the street on education.
In the analysis of education in our National Development Plan, the key issue is that there still is vast inequality. Teachers are paid the same, there's vast inequality, partly because there's a breakdown in accountability in poorer communities, and partly because there's insufficient pressure on teachers to perform. And what the Education Collaboration Partnership does, and it's jointly chaired by Sizwe Ngasana of First Rand Bank and the Minister of Basic Education, Andy Motshekga, they are actually operating in the most challenging districts, talking to teachers. It's behavioral change you've got to effect. Why are teachers not teaching? What are their concerns about the ability to teach? Why do they fear writing the exams? Grade 6 maths teachers don't want to take the grade 6 maths exam. And unless you can break that, and there's a lot of persuasion, there's a lot of behavioral change necessary. And that is clearly the way in which you go. So you've got to change a number of interfaces. It means that you must actually get people on the ground. One of the interfaces is that interface between teachers and learners, and part of it is about making way for new technology to come in, because in more affluent parts of this society and other societies, learners have access to tablets, they have access to the internet, and they can drive themselves at their own pace. In poor communities, this isn't happening. So that interface is fundamentally important, but similarly, the accountability of the teacher to the manager of the school principal, is important, and that needs to change. And thirdly, the accountability of the school to the community it serves through a parent body is equally important. Now, you can't do these things by remote control. You can't do them by ministerial pronouncements from Pretoria. You actually have to get onto the ground, into the district, and begin to change it there. The one lesson, and last Friday there was a report to the President and ministers on work done in the past year. The one lesson from this is that it's slow and tedious work, step by step. But if you are committed to change, then you've got to drive it there. I don't think that on the education budget alone, big as it is, it would bringing in outside catalysts would be affordable, and so the involvement of the private sector is important. But we need to do the same stuff in the provision of health care, because we're seeing the gap between private provision in this country and public provision, and the ratio is very interesting. About 18% of South Africans have access to private care through medical aid, and the expenditure is roughly equivalent, so 80% of people use a system that is actually incredibly overburdened and can't cope. You've got to fix the health system, because if we fail to do that, I think that the sense of hope and care within this democracy is going to be severely under pressure.
Jim, you want to weigh in here?
Trevor said something really important in his opening comment. He said the existing paradigm is wrong, okay? Klaus pointed to that. Economic activity by itself will not solve the problem. Economic activity doesn't necessarily help. Jim Kim, the new president of the World Bank, says this. He says, all his predecessors said, activity ends poverty. Not true. You've got to aim at it. You've got to aim at it. So how do you aim economic activity at ending poverty? There's a new generation of young business people who think of themselves as social entrepreneurs, what I call purposeful business. They want to use business for the purpose of reducing inequality and poverty. See, what do you do? We had this panel at Davos in 2009 after the big crisis, and our panel, first time they had a session on values in the market. And we said, what do you do when the invisible hand, Adam Smith's invisible hand, lets go of the common good? Lets go of Ubuntu. How do you redirect? The market by itself will not solve this unless you aim at specific goals. So I love that paradigm being wrong. And in the US, financial capital, the finance part of it used to be 12% of corporate profits. And when that happened, they could say they were facilitating productive capitalism. Financial profits now in the US are 47% of corporate profits. When that happens, something has gone wrong. Money, making money, from money, producing, accomplishing nothing, but making more money from money.
Jim, Trevor mentioned that this is going to take a long time. And we don't have the luxury of time on our side. If we do not move quickly to resolve this issue of economic inequality, of closing the gap between the rich and the poor, we are going to face some very serious challenges in the very short term. What do you make of this discussion on time?
You know, how do you change social norms is the question. I spoke last year to 20,000 Catholics in the U.S. And I said, who would have thought, raise your hand, that the leader who would most change your church and the world's perception of Christianity would come from your church? Francis. Nobody raised their hand. Francis shows a kind of authenticity and a simplicity and leadership that shows changes things. I heard executives here, CEOs talk about reducing their executive compensation publicly in this context for the sake of inequality. I think leadership makes a big difference, and Francis shows how leadership can change things quickly, perceptions, social norms. So leadership is always, and Nelson Mandela taught us all. We had our service for Nelson Mandela, and I said to our National Cathedral service, Nelson Mandela taught us that leadership is not just about skills, it's about sacrifice.
Jim,
So
we're
what does that
running
mean?
out of time. I'm going to pick up there. Trevor, you want to add?
Let me talk about what's wrong. You see, your panelists here are all too old.
I beg your pardon.
We are all too old. You see, we must step aside and allow young people who understand the world differently, who engage with issues, who communicate differently, to take control of what needs to happen. We're as old as the institutions that sit across the multilateral world. The UN, the World Bank, the IMF constructed at the end of World War II, now past its sell-by date. We need new ideas. We need young people to take control. We need them to drive the agenda. And that, I think, is part of what we need to be doing right now in shifting the paradigm. We are too defensive of a world we understand. And unless we understand and appreciate that decisions are intergenerational, we will repeat the mistakes of the last 50 years or so.
Suzanne, you took exception to being called old. Can
but
you come in here?
I can, but I do actually agree with Trevor that I do think this should be younger people. And I work a hell of a lot with amazing young entrepreneurs. We run 2 entrepreneurial academies. And to feel the energy of these young entrepreneurs who are looking for a better way to change the world, to make a social impact, not just in their own lives, but as part of society, to do work and business for the greater good of society. That is the entrepreneurial spirit. And I think that is the role that leadership needs to play in mentoring and growing entrepreneurs even further.
Derek, you want to add?
Yeah, no, I was just saying to Jim before we came in that one of the best things he could do as we start building the social covenant is to think about this being a gift of ideas to the next generation and how you actually engage them in actually taking up the action on their behalf. One of the ways I think that we fail to actually make tomorrow real is to fail to build on work that I think Clem Sudner did very well for all of us when he painted the scenarios all those decades back on what would be the consequences of inaction or continued status quo. I think now we need to be thinking about doing that again, so we get a shared sense of some realities, that there are certain demographic realities and inequality realities that are going to happen over the next decades unless we act dramatically. And then there's some positive trends, and they are being driven by young people, and they tend to be in the field of science, technology, and entrepreneurship. Very different ways forward that could give us a way out of some of the problems.
Can I
Manuel,
just say that
yes.
I got my theology of hope from South Africa, from the old leaders in the old story. I've been here for a month, and Trevor's right. The new generation of leaders here is trying to say political liberation was their agenda. Our agenda is economic liberation. I'm feeling hopeful again by what I'm seeing with the new generation here in South Africa.